The call came on a cold October morning. My grandfather had passed away peacefully in his sleep at the age of 92. We had always been close, bonded by our shared love of railroads and history. I had spent countless summers at his rural property, listening to stories of his 40 years working for the railroad as we walked along the private rail spur that cut through his land. The reading of the will was brief but emotional. As his only grandson and fellow railroad enthusiast, I inherited his primary asset, the 10-acre property with the historic rail spur that connected to the main line. The executor handed me a large metal key ring. "Your grandfather wanted you to have these first," he said. "The keys to the property and his workshop. Everything else can wait." I recognized the distinctive brass railroad switch key among them, its patina telling the story of decades of use. The property had been in our family since the 1940s, when the railroad company had granted my grandfather special permission to build the private spur line to service what was once a small lumber operation. Long after the business closed, he had maintained the line out of love and respect for railroad heritage. The property sat on the edge of what had, in recent decades, become an upscale planned community with an active homeowners association. I spent that first weekend exploring my inheritance. The modest house was full of railroad memorabilia, original conductor lanterns, switch plates, timetables, and photographs of massive steam engines. In his office, I discovered a large leather portfolio. Inside were the original easement documents, maintenance records, and correspondence with the railroad company dating back 70 years. Every right-of-way was meticulously documented, every agreement preserved. My excitement grew as I walked the property line, following the overgrown but still intact tracks that ran from the main rail line across a small road and onto the property. Most of the metal was in good condition, protected by a layer of rust that had actually preserved the rails from deeper corrosion. The wooden ties needed replacement in sections, but the rail bed itself was sound. I could restore this. I could honor his legacy. I drafted plans to clear the overgrowth, replace damaged ties, and eventually run a small vintage locomotive for historical demonstrations. Perhaps even set up a small railroad museum in the old workshop. The local historical society would surely be interested. I contacted the railroad company that owned the main line, and they confirmed the easement remained valid. The project might take years, but it would be worth it. Then the letter arrived. Official HOA letterhead, stern language, accusations of aesthetic violations, and unauthorized commercial activity. According to the letter, my restoration efforts violated community standards. I was ordered to cease all work immediately. The letter was signed by the HOA president, Karen Whitfield. I attended the next HOA meeting, portfolio of legal documents in hand. The community center was crowded with residents I did not know. I signed up to speak during the open comments section. When my name was called, I approached the microphone with confidence, explaining the historical significance of the rail spur and my legal right to maintain it. Karen sat at the center of the board table, her blonde hair pulled into a perfect bun, designer glasses perched on her nose. Before I could even present the documentation, she cut me off with a wave of her manicured hand. "That rusty eyesore may have been acceptable 50 years ago, but this is a premium community now," she said, not even looking up from her notes. "The HOA guidelines clearly prohibit industrial equipment. Your grandfather was grandfathered in, so to speak, but any new development or restoration constitutes new construction, which requires board approval." I tried to explain about the legally binding easement agreements that predated the HOA by decades, but Karen simply spoke over me. "Your time is up. Next speaker, please." As I returned to my seat, clutching my unreviewed documents, I realized this would not be a simple matter of education or historical appreciation. The cold hostility in that room made one thing perfectly clear. My family legacy was under threat, and the battle to preserve it had just begun. The dismissal at the HOA meeting left me stunned but determined. That weekend, I spread the documents across my dining room table and began to build my case. Property law books borrowed from the library sat in stacks as I highlighted relevant passages about easements and grandfathered rights. The lamp burned late into the night as I educated myself on the legal foundation of my position. The railroad easement was ironclad. My grandfather had secured perpetual rights from the railroad company in 1943, and those rights had transferred with the property deed. The HOA, which had only been established in 1997, could not retroactively override legally binding agreements that predated their existence. At least, that was my understanding. To confirm my research, I consulted with Sarah Mitchell, an attorney who specialized in railroad and property law. Her office was wood-paneled and serious, with model trains displayed in a glass case, a good sign. She reviewed my documentation carefully, nodding as she turned each yellowed page. "These easement agreements are absolutely binding," she confirmed, looking up from the papers. "The railroad granted your grandfather perpetual right-of-way across their property to access the main line. The HOA has no legal authority to revoke rights established decades before they existed." "So I can continue my restoration project?" I asked. "Legally, yes," she replied, her expression grave. "Practically, however, HOAs have ways of making life difficult for residents who challenge them. They can levy fines, place liens, and drag out expensive legal battles. Your case is strong, but fighting will be costly and time-consuming." Armed with legal confirmation, I prepared a formal response to the HOA. I compiled a professional binder with copies of all relevant documentation, including a letter from my attorney explaining the legal precedents of the easement rights. I delivered it personally to the HOA office, requesting it be distributed to all board members before the next meeting. At that meeting, I once again requested time to speak. This time, I brought detailed historical context, photographs of the rail spur in operation during the 1950s, documentation of its historical significance from the County Historical Society, and a clear timeline establishing that my rights predated the HOA by over 50 years. Karen barely glanced at the materials. "The board has reviewed your submission and finds it irrelevant to current community standards," she stated flatly. "This matter is not open for further discussion. The board has voted to issue a formal cease and desist letter. Continued violations will result in fines of $100 per day." The certified cease and desist letter arrived 3 days later, requiring my signature upon delivery. The demand for signature felt like a shot across the bow, an official escalation of hostilities. The letter threatened legal action if I did not halt all restoration activities immediately. During this time, I began to notice a clear division forming in the neighborhood. Older residents who had lived there before the HOA formation often stopped by to express support, sharing stories of my grandfather and the history of the area. Newer residents in luxury vehicles would slow down as they passed, glaring at the rail spur with obvious disdain. Through conversations with supportive neighbors, I learned that Karen had a personal vendetta against what she called eyesores. She had purchased her luxury home 5 years ago and immediately ran for HOA president on a platform of property value protection. Since then, she had aggressively targeted anything she deemed detrimental to the community's upscale image. One evening, I noticed a car driving slowly past my property, the driver clearly photographing the rail spur. The next day, the same car belonged to Karen's husband. Concerned about potential trespassing or sabotage, I installed security cameras along my property line, with particular focus on the rail spur and access points. The system included dusk-to-dawn lights that illuminated the tracks at night, both for security and to highlight what had become not just a hobby, but a cause worth fighting for. Despite the cease and desist letter, I began restoration work on the rail spur at dawn on a Saturday morning. The physical labor felt good, therapeutic even, as I cleared decades of overgrowth from the rails. Sweat dripped down my face as I pulled stubborn vines and cut back invasive bushes that had grown between the ties. Each foot of cleared track revealed more of the past, more of my grandfather's legacy. Several neighbors stopped by throughout the day, the older ones offering encouragement and occasionally cold drinks. Mr. Jenkins, who had known my grandfather for 30 years, brought over old photographs of the rail spur in operation during the 1960s. "Your grandfather would be proud," he said, his weathered hand resting on my shoulder. "Do not let them bully you into erasing history." The next morning, I found a note tucked under my windshield wiper. The handwriting was neat but carried no signature. "Stop the railroad project or face consequences. This is your only warning." I carefully placed the note in a plastic bag to preserve any potential fingerprints and added it to my growing file of HOA harassment. The security cameras proved their worth 3 nights later. Reviewing the footage, I watched as 2 figures with flashlights moved along my property line after midnight. Even in the infrared camera view, I could identify Karen and Robert Connolly, the HOA secretary, trespassing on my property. They photographed the rail spur from multiple angles, whispering to each other as they documented my work. I saved the footage, adding it to my legal evidence file. The trespassing was a clear violation of the law, regardless of HOA rules, but the worst was yet to come. The following weekend, I discovered that someone had damaged several restored sections of the track. The damage was deliberate and systematic: saw marks on replaced wooden ties, spikes removed and scattered, and a section of rail that had been maliciously bent using some kind of tool. This was not random vandalism. It was targeted sabotage. My security cameras had not caught the actual vandalism. The perpetrators had been careful to approach from the wooded area behind the property where I had not yet installed cameras. I immediately expanded my security system to cover all approaches and reported the vandalism to the local police. The officer who responded seemed sympathetic, but warned me that without direct evidence, there was little they could do beyond filing a report. The escalation continued when I received notice that the HOA had filed a formal complaint with the county zoning board, claiming my restoration work constituted an unauthorized change of land use from residential to commercial or industrial. The complaint required me to attend a hearing and defend my project. The county zoning office was sterile and unsympathetic, a maze of beige cubicles and fluorescent lighting. The hearing officer listened to both sides with practiced neutrality. Karen presented an elaborate slideshow depicting my rail spur as a dangerous, unsightly industrial operation that threatened property values throughout the community. I countered with my historical documentation and legal easements. The hearing ended without resolution, with the officer promising a written determination within 30 days. The bureaucratic delay felt intentional, designed to halt my progress through administrative red tape. In this darkest moment, an unexpected ally emerged. The County Historical Society contacted me after hearing about the dispute. Their email expressed strong interest in helping preserve the rail spur as one of the few remaining private connections to the golden age of American railroads. They offered resources, documentation of historical significance, and potentially even grant funding for authentic restoration work. Even more validating, I received an official letter from Central Pacific Railroad, the company that owned the main line to which my spur connected. Their operations manager, Michael Reynolds, requested an in-person meeting to discuss my restoration plans. The railroad company offices were industrial and practical, with maps of rail networks covering entire walls. Reynolds examined my grandfather's original documents, running his finger along the faded signatures. "These easements are still binding," he confirmed with a firm nod. "Central Pacific recognizes and honors these historical rights-of-way. Your grandfather was respected in the railroad community, and we see value in preserving these connections to our shared heritage." He extended his hand, his grip firm and assured. "The company will provide technical guidance on restoration to ensure compliance with modern safety standards. Once your spur meets those standards, we can discuss limited connection rights for historical demonstrations." I left the meeting with renewed determination. The Historical Society supported me. The railroad company validated my rights. My position was strengthening, even as the HOA escalated their opposition. What had begun as a personal project to honor my grandfather had evolved into something larger, a battle to preserve a piece of American industrial history against those who would erase it in the name of property values and manufactured aesthetics. 2 weeks after my meeting with the railroad company, a bright orange notice appeared in every mailbox throughout the neighborhood. The HOA had called an emergency community meeting to address ongoing violations threatening property values. My rail spur restoration was listed as the primary agenda item, described as an industrial eyesore and unauthorized commercial development. The community center buzzed with tension as neighbors filed in for the meeting. I arrived early, setting up my presentation materials at a small side table. My hands trembled slightly as I arranged historical photographs, legal documents, and restoration plans. Several older residents nodded encouragingly as they passed, while newer homeowners whispered among themselves, casting suspicious glances in my direction. Karen entered precisely at 7:00 p.m., flanked by the other board members. Her tailored blazer and perfect makeup projected the corporate authority she clearly relished. She rapped her gavel with practiced precision, calling the meeting to order. "We are facing a serious threat to our community standards," she began, her voice carrying through the room without need of the microphone. "For those who have not seen it firsthand, I present Exhibit A, the industrial railroad operation being conducted at 1472 Maple Avenue." The projector illuminated the wall with photographs of my property. They were cleverly angled to make the restoration work appear as chaotic and industrial as possible. Close-ups showed rust and weathered wood out of context. One particular image captured me working on the tracks, shot in a way that made it seem like a commercial operation rather than a private restoration project. This is a clear violation of Section 8.3 of our HOA Covenant, which prohibits industrial equipment and commercial operations in our residential community, Karen continued. The board proposes an immediate fine structure of $250 per day until this eyesore is removed, with legal action to follow if necessary. Before I could respond, Karen turned to the next slide, a graph showing alleged property value declines in neighborhoods with industrial features. The data had no citations or sources. "I have prepared a presentation addressing these concerns," I said, standing and moving toward the projector. "We are not here for a history lesson," Karen interrupted, her voice sharp. "This is about current HOA regulations and property values. The legal easements and historical significance are directly relevant to this discussion," I insisted. Karen dramatically checked her watch. "You have 3 minutes." I connected my laptop to the projector and began displaying historical photographs of my grandfather standing proudly beside the rail spur in its heyday. I explained the historical significance of the connection, the legal easements that predated the HOA, and my restoration plans that included safety improvements and aesthetic enhancements. Before I could finish explaining the legal precedents supporting my position, Karen's manicured hand shut off the projector. "Time's up," she announced. "The board will now call for a vote on the proposed fine structure." "This is ridiculous," a voice called from the back of the room. It was Tom Henderson, a retired attorney who had lived in the neighborhood for 30 years. "You cannot vote without allowing a full presentation of relevant facts." "The board has reviewed all materials," Karen responded dismissively. "No, you have not," said Alina Wilson, another longtime resident. "I was on the original HOA formation committee in 1997. We specifically acknowledged existing easements and historical features when drafting the original covenants." The room erupted into factions. Newer residents argued about property values and neighborhood character, while longer-term residents defended property rights and historical preservation. What had been presented as a simple vote transformed into a community-wide debate about the very purpose of the HOA. From the back of the room, a young woman quietly took notes. I had not noticed her enter, but the press badge hanging around her neck identified her as a reporter from the local newspaper. The community conflict had apparently become newsworthy. Karen eventually regained control of the meeting and forced through a vote on the fine structure. The measure passed by a narrow margin, though many residents abstained in protest of the procedural issues. 3 days later, the county newspaper ran a front-page story titled, "David versus Goliath. Historic Railroad Preservation Faces HOA Opposition." The article framed the conflict as a battle between heritage preservation and corporate-style regulation, complete with photographs of the rail spur juxtaposed against images of the HOA board. The public exposure escalated the conflict further. A heavy envelope arrived via courier the following week, a formal legal threat from Harrington and Wallace, an expensive law firm retained by the HOA. The letter, printed on heavy card stock with gold embossing, threatened injunctive relief if I did not cease restoration activities immediately. During this period, I began to notice a pattern in HOA enforcement throughout the neighborhood. Through conversations with other residents, I discovered that Karen had been selectively enforcing rules against people she personally disliked, while ignoring violations by her friends and allies. The Johnsons had been fined for their vegetable garden being visible from the street, while Karen's friend Susan had a nearly identical garden with no consequences. The Patels had received violation notices for their holiday decorations being up 3 days too long, while board member Holmes regularly flouted the same guidelines. These discoveries strengthened my resolve. The battle was no longer just about my railroad spur. It had become a fight against selective enforcement and the abuse of HOA power. The battle lines were drawn not just for my family legacy, but for the soul of the neighborhood itself. The mounting legal pressure from the HOA forced me to commit fully to Sarah Mitchell's services as my attorney. Her paralegal began the painstaking process of reviewing every HOA document, covenant, and amendment filed since the association's formation in 1997. We needed to find any procedural errors or overreach that could strengthen our position. Discovery is often where these cases turn, Sarah explained during one of our strategy sessions. HOAs typically rely on residents simply giving in rather than fighting back. When actually challenged, their documentation often reveals weaknesses or procedural failures. Her office became a war room of sorts. Stacks of HOA documents and county records covered the conference table as we pored over maps spread across the surface. Sarah's paralegal, meticulously organized despite the chaos of paperwork, created a detailed timeline of property ownership, easement rights, and HOA actions. 3 weeks into the discovery process, Sarah called with excitement in her voice. "We found something significant," she said. "The HOA never properly incorporated the original rail easement into their governing documents. In fact, the original survey they used when establishing the HOA boundaries incorrectly maps several critical areas." I met her at her office that afternoon. She pointed to a boundary map dated 1997. "Look here. When the developer created this subdivision and established the HOA, they used an incomplete survey. Your grandfather's easement rights were filed with the railroad company and the county, but not explicitly acknowledged in the HOA formation documents." "What does that mean for our case?" I asked. "It means they cannot regulate what they never properly documented," she replied. "But there is something even more interesting." She slid another map across the table. "See this small parcel here? This is where your rail spur crosses Oakwood Drive to connect with the main line." I leaned closer, examining the small section highlighted in yellow. "This crossing parcel was never properly transferred to HOA control," she continued, excitement evident in her voice. "It exists in a sort of ownership limbo. The original developer intended to deed it to the county as a road easement, but the paperwork was never completed. According to county records, it is still listed as available railroad right-of-way property." The implications slowly dawned on me. So who actually owns the crossing? Technically, it is unclaimed property being held by the county. And here is the interesting part. It could be purchased by a private party through a specific petition process. The county records office confirmed Sarah's findings. The small parcel where my rail spur crossed Oakwood Drive, the only road connecting the subdivision to the main highway, had indeed never been properly transferred. The clerk's finger traced property lines on ancient plat maps, showing the oversight that had gone unnoticed for decades. "These things happen more often than you would think," the clerk explained. "Especially in developments built before digital record-keeping, small parcels fall through the cracks during transfers." A plan began forming in my mind, audacious but potentially effective. If I could acquire the crossing property, I would control a critical access point to the entire subdivision. It would give me leverage against the HOA's continued harassment. Sarah arranged a private meeting with executives from Central Pacific Railroad in their wood-paneled conference room. Michael Reynolds and the company's legal counsel listened intently as we presented our discovery and potential strategy. The crossing is indeed a critical control point, Reynolds confirmed. From a railroad perspective, private ownership of that parcel would actually simplify matters for us. The HOA has been problematic about maintenance access and right-of-way clearing. Would the railroad company oppose my petition to purchase the parcel? I asked directly. Reynolds exchanged glances with the legal counsel, who gave a slight nod. Not only would we not oppose it, we would provide documentation supporting your historical connection to the property and the continuity of the rail easement. It would be in our interest to have that crossing under sympathetic ownership. Over the next 2 weeks, Sarah meticulously prepared the petition for property acquisition. The process required historical documentation, surveys, and proof of adjoining property interest, all of which we had in abundance thanks to my grandfather's detailed records. The key was to complete the process without alerting the HOA. If Karen discovered our strategy before the purchase was finalized, she could potentially file a competing claim on behalf of the association. We submitted all documentation in person rather than through easily monitored electronic channels. As I signed the final petition documents in Sarah's office, she slid the paperwork into a manila envelope with a knowing smile. "Now we wait," she said. "The review typically takes 30 days, but we have requested expedited processing based on the historical significance of the rail easement." That evening I drove slowly past the crossing, seeing it with new eyes. The small patch of land, perhaps 50 feet by 30 feet, was unremarkable in appearance but potentially game-changing in strategic value. Under cover of dusk, a county surveyor discreetly placed property stake markers as part of the petition process, the small flags barely visible in the fading light. The chess pieces were moving. For weeks, Karen and the HOA had been playing offense, forcing me to react defensively. But with this move, the dynamic would shift. For the first time since this conflict began, Karen did not see what was coming. The certified mail confirmation arrived exactly 28 days after submitting the petition. My hands trembled slightly as I signed for the envelope. Inside was the official deed transfer and property registration for the rail crossing parcel. The ownership was now legal and recorded with the county. I held the documents carefully, almost reverently, knowing what they represented. Not just ownership of land, but a profound shift in power. That same afternoon, another certified letter arrived from the HOA. This one contained their final warning, threatening immediate legal action if I did not cease all rail spur restoration work and remove the industrial equipment within 7 days. The letter mentioned the significant legal fees they were prepared to spend to enforce compliance. Karen had clearly escalated to what she believed was her final move. The monthly HOA meeting was scheduled for that evening. I decided to attend, knowing it would likely be hostile but necessary for my strategy. Sarah advised me on exactly how to handle the confrontation that would inevitably occur. The community center meeting room had never felt more tense. Karen sat at the center of the board table, a stack of folders in front of her. She barely acknowledged my entrance, though several residents nodded or waved quietly. I took a seat in the back row, waiting for the appropriate moment. After routine business matters, Karen moved to the ongoing violations section of the agenda. The projector flickered to life, displaying photos of my property labeled Community Eyesore in bold red letters. As you can see from these updated photographs, the situation at 1472 Maple Avenue has only deteriorated, Karen began, her voice dripping with contempt. Despite multiple notices, fines, and legal warnings, the unauthorized industrial railroad construction continues. She clicked through a slideshow of images, each one carefully selected and framed to make my restoration work look as unsightly as possible. Close-up photos of rust and dirt, angled shots that exaggerated scale, and even one image that had clearly been digitally darkened to appear more industrial. The board has exhausted all reasonable options, she continued. Tonight, we will vote on pursuing immediate injunctive relief through the courts, which our attorneys advise will likely result in a court order to remove the railroad equipment entirely. I sat quietly during her presentation, my expression revealing nothing while neighbors shifted uncomfortably in their seats. Several glanced at me with sympathy, while others nodded along with Karen's assessment. The board voted unanimously to pursue legal action, as expected. When Karen asked if there were any comments from the floor before moving to the next agenda item, I raised my hand. The chair recognizes the resident from 1472 Maple Avenue. For 1 minute only, Karen said, making a show of starting a timer on her phone. I approached the podium with measured steps, carrying a leather portfolio. "Thank you, Madam President," I began, my voice steady despite my racing heart. "Before the board proceeds with legal action, there is new information that should be considered." Karen sighed dramatically. "We have reviewed all your historical documents repeatedly. They do not override HOA covenants." "This is not about history," I replied calmly. "This is about current property ownership and access rights." I removed the deed and property registration from my portfolio, along with a large survey map. "As of yesterday, I am the legal owner of the rail crossing parcel at the intersection of Oakwood Drive and the main highway." The room fell silent. Karen's expression transformed from smugness to confusion as I placed the documents on the table in front of her. "That is HOA property," she stated flatly, not even looking at the papers. "No, it never was," I explained. "Due to an oversight during the original development, that parcel was never transferred to either the HOA or the county. It remained unclaimed railroad right-of-way. I have legally acquired it through proper channels." The county recorder's seal gleamed under the fluorescent lights as I slid the property deed across the table. Karen finally picked up the document, her face paling as she read. "This is some kind of trick," she insisted, but her voice had lost its confident edge. "It is completely legal and properly recorded," I said, "and as the owner of that crossing, I have the right to control access across it." I paused, letting the implications sink in. "Beginning 30 days from today, I intend to close that crossing to all but authorized traffic." Gasps and murmurs rippled through the room as residents realized what this meant. The crossing was the only road connecting the subdivision to the highway. Without access, no one could enter or leave the neighborhood by vehicle. "You cannot do that," Karen exclaimed, her composure finally cracking. "It is a public road." "It is not," I corrected calmly. "It is a private crossing on a private easement, as these documents clearly show. However, I am prepared to grant a permanent access easement to the community with one condition. The HOA must acknowledge my railroad easement rights in perpetuity and cease all actions against my restoration project." The room erupted in chaos. Neighbors turned to each other in disbelief, some shouting questions, others demanding Karen do something. For the first time since I had known her, Karen was speechless, her power visibly draining away as community eyes turned accusingly toward her leadership. "You have 30 days to make your decision," I said, gathering my documents. "I suggest you use the legal budget you have allocated for fighting me to instead have your attorneys review these papers. They will confirm everything I have said." As I walked out of the meeting, the cacophony of voices followed me. I had not wanted to take such a drastic step, but months of harassment, sabotage, and legal threats had left me no choice. Sometimes, the only way to stop a bully was to demonstrate that you held the true power all along. The response came faster than I anticipated. 3 days after the dramatic HOA meeting, a knock at my door revealed 2 nervous-looking board members, the treasurer and secretary, but notably not Karen. "We would like to discuss a compromise," the treasurer said, his tone conciliatory. "The emergency board session last night had a different energy without Karen present." I invited them in, offering coffee, which they gratefully accepted. Sunlight streamed through the windows, illuminating the dining room table where I had spread out the original documents that had started this journey. Karen has been temporarily suspended from her duties as president, the secretary explained, stirring her coffee slowly. The board recognizes that this situation has escalated unnecessarily. We are prepared to acknowledge your historical easement rights if you will reconsider the crossing closure. I never wanted to close the crossing, I admitted. I only wanted the harassment to stop and my rights to be respected. We discussed terms for over an hour, finding common ground more easily than I had expected. Without Karen's dominating presence, the board members were surprisingly reasonable. They acknowledged that the HOA had overstepped its authority regarding pre-existing easements and agreed that historical preservation had value for the entire community. Meanwhile, Karen had not accepted her suspension gracefully. From her attorney's office, she launched a desperate last-ditch effort to invalidate my ownership of the crossing parcel. Cease and desist letters arrived daily, each more threatening than the last. My attorney confidently added them to our growing file, unfazed by the empty threats. Her claims have no legal merit, Sarah assured me after reviewing the latest letter. Your ownership is properly documented and recorded. Her personal objections cannot override county records. The community called a special meeting the following week. Despite a dramatic thunderstorm that rattled windows and flooded streets, turnout was nearly complete. Nature itself seemed to be washing away the old regime as residents voted overwhelmingly to remove Karen from the HOA presidency permanently. The minutes recorded her countless procedural violations, selective enforcement actions, and failure to properly review legal documents before taking action. 2 weeks after my confrontation at the board meeting, we gathered on my property for the formal signing ceremony. A table had been set up beside the now partially restored rail spur, with the county recorder present to witness and file the agreements. The documents ensured both my rights and community access were protected in perpetuity. The main agreement contained 2 key provisions. The HOA acknowledged my railroad easement rights and supported my restoration project as a historical preservation effort. And in exchange, I granted a permanent access easement across the crossing to all community residents and visitors. This is how it should have been from the beginning, the new HOA president said as we shook hands after signing. Neighbors working together instead of against each other. 6 months later, my restoration project was nearly complete. The Historical Society had provided a grant for authentic materials, and the railroad company had offered technical expertise to ensure everything met modern safety standards. The rusty eyesore that Karen had so despised had transformed into a lovingly restored piece of American industrial history. The epilogue to this story unfolded on a golden autumn afternoon. Neighborhood children gathered along the freshly painted rail fence as a vintage locomotive made its first ceremonial visit down the restored spur. The engineer blew the whistle, its mournful sound echoing across the community that had once been so divided. Former adversaries now stood side by side, watching history come alive before their eyes. Even some of Karen's former allies admitted the restoration had become a point of community pride and distinction rather than a liability. A small bronze plaque now stood at the entrance to the property, commemorating my grandfather's 40 years of railroad service and his contribution to local history. Justice and legacy had been preserved not just for my family, but for everyone who valued the tangible connections to our shared past. As for Karen, she sold her house and moved away shortly after losing her position. I sometimes wondered if she realized how her crusade against my eyesore had ultimately transformed it into a celebrated historical attraction that now appeared in county tourism brochures. In the end, her need to control had cost her everything, while my defense of history had created something that would outlast us all.